Hi, and welcome back to the committee program with me, Arun Chaudhary, your host. And today we are actually talking about Podemos, who is, a left-wing populist party in Spain that really captured the imagination of U.S. campaigners. I was just telling our panel, sort of after 2016, when that first wave of Bernie folks went over into Europe. But anyway, let's dig in. I think there's a lot to talk about. So this last May 4th, Pablo Iglesias, the Secretary General and founder of anti-austerity populist, if this word still means anything, party Podemos in Spain, quit politics, stepping down from all of his posts. Previously, he was not just the founder of this party, but a figure of the left, a media personality, and part of the rising anti-austerity movement that had been capturing Spanish imagination. Podemos also caught the imagination of the international left, but after a tough electoral showing in the party's stronghold of Madrid, Iglesias, before cutting his famously long hair, said, "I will stay committed to this country, but I do not want to block a renovation of leadership." He said, "When a person is no longer useful, they have to know when to quit." But that sort of begs the question, what was the utility and is the utility of the Podemos project? How did it change the landscape of Spanish and European politics? And where does it fit into the history of national and international progressive politics? With us to discuss Podemos, our friend of the show, Paolo Gerbaudo, sociologist and senior lecturer in digital culture and society at King's College London, and author of the upcoming The Great Recoil, Politics After Populism and Pandemic. Dr. Cristina Fominaya, reader in social politics and media at Loughborough University, editor-in-chief of the Social Movement Studies Journal, and author of Democracy Reloaded, Inside Spain's Political Laboratory from 15M to Podemos. And Jorge Rosina, lecturer of political science at the Complutense University of Madrid, which is where Pablo was also a teacher, right? Yeah. And is the vice dean of the Faculty of Political Science and Sociology. I suppose you all have his picture up in the faculty lounge. But Cristina, let's start with you. So, like I said, most U.S. progressives will not have heard of Podemos until that first wave. But the story begins a bit earlier in 2014 at the founding, and even before that, obviously, with the kind of rise of austerity and anti-austerity in Latin America. But I'll let you. What can you tell us about the origin story and how this space on the Spanish left was unoccupied?
The origin story has to start with the 15M movement, known internationally more as the Indignados movement or the outrage movement, that took the squares of the city, especially starting in Madrid with the mass camp. And that was a movement for real democracy now. And the movement was pro-democracy and also anti-austerity. So those were the two twin pillars, if you will, of what they were going for. And the movement mobilized millions of Spaniards, transformed public opinion, kicked off a debate about democracy. It was just an absolutely remarkable wave of mobilization from about 2011 to 2013. Then we start to see a little bit of a dropping off of mobilization. And that's when Podemos' founders decide that there's a political opportunity that hasn't been channeled or exploited. And the reason I say this is that despite the fact that millions of people were mobilizing and demanding change, neither of the established parties, neither the Socialist Party or the Popular Party, which is a right-wing party, had responded in any meaningful way to the demands for democratic reform, greater transparency. They were just carrying on with austerity politics pretty much as usual. And Podemos saw an opportunity to try to take that disenfranchised citizenship, that voter potential, and flip it around. But they were, who were they? They were just a couple of media personalities. They were longtime activists. They were friends and people who knew each other from the university. They were very plugged into activist networks. And so they knew that they needed the support of the movement to be able to channel the spirit of the movement. So they were kind of capitalizing on the 15M spirit and energy and the massive influence that movement had. And so they did that in very specific and very strategic ways. First of all, by trying to make sure that they were appealing to the political culture of the movement and the demands of the movement, and presenting themselves as something that was synergistic with the movement's principles. Why did they have to do that? Because the movement was an anti-established party movement, and it said, politicians do not represent us. We want real democracy now. So Podemos had to say, well, we are going to kind of represent, but we're not really going to represent because we really, so they had to navigate that movement identity or collective identity and political culture and find a way to convince people that they wouldn't be giving up on their autonomous principles, they wouldn't be giving up on their demands for real democracy now, even if they supported an electoral or representative party. So that's kind of by way of just giving you the background to when they sort of enter onto the scene. There's much more we can say, but yeah.
No, certainly. I mean, Jorge, how would you say that the traditional center-left, I think probably represented by the Socialist Workers' Party at that time, lost the movement, as Cristina describes them, because that is a different thing, especially American politics. People will recognize that.
Yeah, well, because in Spain we have PSOE, that is the typical and classical social democrat European party. The problem is that in the last decades, the social democratic ideology, especially in Europe, has been losing its influence, and it doesn't answer the problems, for example, the crisis that we had in 2011, because people, especially my generation, felt the crisis as a kind of a scam, fraud, so they need another kind of response. And I think that, as Cristina said, Podemos was really strategic to channel the social movements and the social energy that 15M had. I think that the problem is what was the kind of answer that after a while Podemos has given. Because if you analyze now, currently, we have a problem. Maybe it's not an exclusive problem in Spain, it's a general problem, especially in the south of Europe. Because if you think 7 years ago, we had a kind of left wave. And now we are living a counter wave with far-right political parties who are reframing the consequences of the crisis. And this is worrying, because now, for example, in Portugal, we have Chega with André Ventura. In Italy, we have, of course, Lega Norte, but also we have Fratelli with Meloni. Of course, in France, we have Le Pen, that is inspired all these parties in some sense. And in Spain, we have Vox. And now, even in the electoral results, Vox has won more successful results than Podemos. So this is worrying, and I think that we have to reflect about the kind of answers that leftist movements gave to people, because something was wrong. I don't know what. I think that is not a clear answer, and we have to reflect. But what is sure is that, social democrat doesn't have the response, doesn't have the answer, but neither these new social movements or new parties that were created around 2014.
Yeah, no, exactly. And Paolo, I want to ask you about that moment in 2014 and expand on what Jorge's saying on a bit. This is a moment where we have Syriza in Greece, where we have the five-star movement really starting to win elections and show themselves to be a force. I mean, how much do you think this is part of a European moment, and how much is this an indigenous Spanish push? That's a big question, but I think you can help us out.
I think it's partly both things, in the sense that there was this sense of a purple wave paralleling the pink wave in Latin America. So there was the time in which the generation of 2011, the Indignados in Spain, and the Aganaktismeni, the Greek Indignados in Greece, and people in other countries were really looking with a lot of hope to this left renewal. And then shortly after, in 2015, obviously Jeremy Corbyn becomes the leader of the Labour Party. So there was really this big sense of renewal, of possibility of doing something, of changing something. But it's also something that is really specific to Spain, and to the miracle of the Indignados, which is a movement that has no equals in terms of its breadth, its strength, its popular support. I mean, it's more than Occupy Wall Street, right? I mean, imagine Occupy Wall Street redoubled or in much greater form. So what happened there was a movement that at some point 70% support of the population. It had a huge popular sympathy and a level of territorial capillarity which was huge, even in the kind of most remote pueblo of Castilla. You could find a small assembly, perhaps 3 people, right? But it was really a movement that was rooted everywhere. And Podemos precisely tries to draw lessons from this movement. And the fundamental lesson is, how comes that so many people are angry with neoliberalism, with austerity, with the present model of capitalism, and the left that has been voicing this critique for such a long time only gets few percentage points in the elections, right? So it demonstrated that movement was both a vindication of the criticism of neoliberalism, austerity, that the left alone conducted, and demonstration of its irrelevance. And therefore, it was calling for something different that would overcome the reasons why the radical left, while having the right analysis, was not able to translate that into electoral consensus.
Something different is great until you put pen to paper, of course. Cristina, can you tell us sort of what the actual party program that emerges as they become a real party crystallizes into?
Let me answer a slightly different question, because my brain is tracking back to this origin story, and I'm picking up on what Paolo was saying. I think what's really important for people to understand is we are now talking about this in terms of left and in terms of right. But what 15M managed to do, and it did again this very strategically, was to frame the movement as a movement of citizens, not as a movement of leftist activists or progressives. So that 70% is so remarkable because the historical cleavages between left and right in Spain are absolutely deeply rooted, and they go back decades and decades and decades. So to be
it's
able
a fresh
to
and painful history,
Yes, and to be able to actually join, I mean, if you say 70%, that means that voters of the Popular Party were supporting the demands of the movement. Now think how remarkable that is, especially if you think about the United States right now and the level of polarization. Imagine right now that I could say, well, there's a movement that mobilizes, 70% of people, including all across the board from Democrats to Republicans. That's remarkable. So that initial stance of we aren't on the left, we aren't on the right, is very much what the Greens did in Germany when they came out. We're neither on the left or the right, we're out in front, we're trying to do something different. We're trying to answer global problems, global challenges in a different way. That's what the Greens said. And Podemos came out saying, we're different, we're like 15M, we're trying to solve citizens' welfare. We want to take care of our people. We want to reclaim the nation for its citizens. And that is really just a continuation of a narrative that the 15M movement itself developed very powerfully, to say we want to reclaim democratic institutions for the citizens. And in my work, that's what I refer to as the democratic turn. So it's when these autonomous movements really start to rethink the relationship with the state, with institutions, and with democracy in a much more explicit and outward-facing way than they had up until then. So Podemos had to present itself as a citizen. It didn't present itself as a party initially. It said it was a citizens' initiative. And only if the people agreed and a sufficient number of people expressed their approval would they continue down this line of sort of trying to create some kind of electoral initiative, and they kept it all very vague. And so in the beginning, they really tried to not be very programmatic. And this is why I'm giving you all this background to your answer, because the minute you're programmatic, you start blocking people out. If you start declaring your position on the environment, on rights, women's rights, or whatever the case may be, immediately people start going, wait a minute, I agree with that, or I don't agree with that. But if you say it's participatory, then everyone's hopes and dreams and illusions can just be kind of laid at the altar of this new project, right? And that's really what happened. So they said, the 15M movement was organized in assemblies, mostly organized in assemblies, which in autonomous politics are horizontal, without leaders, deliberation, participation, collective intelligence, collective action. And so Podemos created what they called the Podemos circles, which were supposed to kind of be the Podemos version of the 15M assemblies. And nobody was really clear what exactly those circles were going to do, how that was going to actually channel into party decision making. All of that was kind of left nebulous. So on the one hand, you have this really nebulous kind of articulation of the project. But on the other hand, you have Pablo Iglesias as a very highly visible media personality who's recognizable, who's a brilliant orator, absolutely brilliant orator, very charismatic, very intelligent, lots of loyal supporters and so on in his kind of immediate group, right? And so they were playing with both of those things. They were galvanizing the movement support and convincing activists to help support that project. And without the activists, they wouldn't have gone anywhere because there were like 5 people. And on the other hand, really mobilizing and very strategically using the visibility of Iglesias himself to translate that into votes. And his media presence, because he was constantly on, people noticed very early on that when he was on these political debate shows, we call them in Spain tertulias, which it's like everybody shouts and talks to each other. Right. And when he would go on, he wouldn't shout, he wouldn't do the thing that most people did, but he would be so prepared with really compelling arguments. And what the news realized very quickly was that their audience share was going up significantly when he was on the panel. And so then he was able then to get into news channels that wouldn't normally be interested in necessarily having a progressive voice because they were looking for that for once capitalism works for something, right? They were looking for that audience share. And so that's kind of the scenario, if you will, of when they're coming onto the scene.
And Jorge, let me ask you, just as they're, again, sort of maturing a bit, they are forming this broader coalition, and there's, Unidos Podemos. Can you sort of explain that phase of the operation?
Yes, but, I think that I would like to say before one thing about Podemos and the tendency that Podemos has had, because I think that it's a general problem everywhere. First, when you have a movement with, that create a huge expectation, after a while you have a lot of people who are frustrated, or at the end you are losing the support. And I think that this is really clear in the case of Podemos, and it's something that happens in general. And the other general tendency everywhere is that there is a general problem when you are a movement and you want to go from the street to the institutions. And I think that this is really problematic, especially in the left spectrum. I think that the problem inside Podemos was that people expect to have a new kind of democratic instrument with circles, more horizontal making decision process, another kind of politics, But after a while, in this transition from the street to the institutions, Podemos turns to be a classical political party.
More ordinary political party.
Yeah, absolutely. With the typical structure and, for example, with some Cesarism in the structure with Pablo Iglesias, because it's true, he's absolutely charismatic, he's a leader, but he is also a controller. So the problem is that people start to see him as a problem and something that is something not new. It's something that people had seen before with other political parties. So people start to lose confidence in Podemos, and the other problem was that in theory Podemos was, and Paolo knows, no? In theory Podemos was a kind of digital party, but the problem is that they are not anymore. If you even check its website, it's really poor.
Yeah. No, even at the height, right? They weren't doing, like, the Rousseau was engaged with constantly by the Cinque Stelle, and there was not an equivalent for Podemos, right? This was a much more pen to paper party.
Yeah, that's the point, and they have a kind of plebiscitarian style with internal referendum. So this is not really new. I think that people were not looking for this. So this is a problem. So let's see now what is happening in the transitional process inside of Podemos, because maybe the problem is not just to have a new leader. The problem is how to make this process. If this process is more democratic or this process is just changing one leader for another. Because now it's supposed to be Ione Belarra, maybe the next leader of Podemos, but everyone knows that Ione Belarra is really close to Pablo Iglesias and Irene Montero. So this is a problem because people, or it seems as is more of the same strategy. So, these few people are trying to control their own political party. So that's the problem. When you have a new instrument, and at the end, this instrument is just a party for a few,
And I think it goes back to Cristina's point about mapping left to right versus elites versus citizens is, perhaps a huge part of the problem. Paolo, I want to ask you a little bit more about what went wrong, but actually just first, Jorge, while we have you, and we're talking about, can you actually surface some of the other personalities or notable candidates, or what are the kinds of folks who Podemos is running, and do they in any way seem different, right? Like, your Cinque Stelle candidates, for instance, in Italy, are, were often smart technocratic folks who didn't even sort of know what the head of the party was saying or if they would be fired by them the next day. I don't think it's the same for Podemos, but tell me some of the characters.
I think the political personnel of each party is always an interesting thing to study. And indeed, in the case of the Five-Star Movement, you will find a lot of technical or scientific personnel, which I think is quite interesting. Actually, despite being considered as ignorant by other parties, they had more degrees than other parties, and they were kind of computer experts, biologists, engineers, and stuff. In the case of Podemos, at least the first elections that they surveyed, because, let's remember, I think it's something very important for our audience. The context is it's a political system in Spain that has been through, I think, a total of 5 elections in the last 7 years.
Yeah.
It's snap election after snap election, which is the greatest symptom of organic crisis of democracy. When a system doesn't manage to form governments, right, is a very basic kind of measure of crisis. But so, say, at least in the first elections, if you look at the MPs Podemos elected, you would find many people like me, Cristina, and Jorge, like many academics, like many political scientists. Which was quite interesting, actually, I think, because there was a new generation of academics that were ready to kind of, in a way, bet on these, often also kind of risking a bit their career prospects in the process, which anyway were already very slim career prospects for the generation, especially in Spain. Then many activists from the Indignados movement. People I met in the squares in 2011, and then met them again as MPs 4 years later, and it was quite amazing because you could really see like people in their 20s, right? People who didn't yet have a steady job and were projected into the institutional sphere with a lot of energy and a lot of also knowledge from the streets, and being able to convert it into policies, into institutional action, There were some people drawn from Izquierda Unida. I mean, Iglesias himself, right, initially was connected to that. Partly his candidacy was also, in a way, a protest against the fact that Izquierda Unida would not run him as a candidate. Other people, such as Sanchez, such as many other kind of high and mid-level figure of Podemos, were also from Izquierda Unida, but also precisely because they thought that Izquierda Unida had inherent limits, was not able to break out of left identitarianism, right? Speaking to the same 5%, 6% of people who have a hammer and sickle flag in their bedroom, whatever. So that is partly, but the interesting thing is that Iglesias also managed to recruit people that you would never think would join a radical left party. For example, a former general, right? That was basically the kind of candidate for Minister of Defense. People even from the originally from the right, as Verstringe. So it was able to broaden out a bit. But yeah, and also he started questioning how it could attract pensioners' votes, for example, that always remain kind of out of the picture. But and he tried to do certain things, but he never really managed to completely break out from that image of being the party of youth and the graduates, in a way. I think there was a limit of the political personnel, but also the kind of electoral appeal, ultimately, of the movement.
And so, we did, and I think even a lot of our audience will be familiar with the constant failure to form coalition governments, and there was the Socialists and Podemos. Cristina, can you walk us through how they were as a coalition partner when all of a sudden it becomes time to sort of not be the kids, but be kind of the mature, grown-up, whatever it is? How did that shake out?
Do you mean in the joining the national government? You mean?
Yeah, during the
coalition government with the Socialist Party.
Yeah.
I mean that whole process was extremely fraught and difficult, and resulted in them not the government not coming into office with as many seats as it would have if Sanchez and Iglesias had been able to reach an agreement in the first time they were called to form a government. So they would have been in a much stronger position to do that. And I think that was an extremely damaging moment. I mean, there's a couple damaging moments for Podemos, I think. For me, personally, my analysis is that the biggest mistake Podemos ever made was joining as a coalition with Izquierda Unida. I think that the minute that they did that, they lost any ability to tell Spanish people that they were doing something new, that they weren't about old left and right. Izquierda Unida has been around for ages. It's an old left party, even if it has a young and charismatic leader. It's been, it had corruption scandals with the Tarjetas Black scandal, which was a whistleblowing scandal about political corruption of political leaders and trade union leaders. So that moment for me, and I know that Iglesias held out for a long time against it. And what's really, really interesting is if you look at the results of Podemos, since that moment, their results have gone worse and worse and worse every election. And they have never managed, even with, to surpass, they've never managed to have a greater sum than the individual parts. So the most they've managed to do is to take the vote that Izquierda Unida would have had on its own and their vote on its own and put them together. But they've never managed to do more than that. So that's kind of by way of saying that there's been a real decline in support and electoral support for a lot of reasons we can talk about. Going into this first round in April of 2019, when they were supposed to be forming a government with PSOE. And I think there was a lot of issues there where Pedro Sanchez didn't want another charismatic leader in his government. He didn't want to be overshadowed by Iglesias, and I think that that's always been an issue. This sort of alpha male, competition. And so he said some very nasty things about Podemos. Podemos, on their part, was very much kind of taking the line, like saying, we have red lines which we will not cross. And our purpose is to change Spanish society and politics and not to become a member of government at any cost. So they were thinking that was going to be, boost their legitimacy in the eyes of the electorate. But what ended up happening is that people were so annoyed at having to go for another round of elections that in fact both parties lost support and credibility. And what we end up having is an absolute massive boost in extreme right party representation in that election, and a drop in seats for Podemos from 42 that they had in the first election of 2019 down to 35. So, we've gone from...
And to you, this is quite simply that the dissatisfied and the disaffected have a new home, a new place to go to, which is the right.
Well, I mean, it's not that simple, right? Because that is coming... we have to understand that there's a shift in the media ecology, even from the time that Podemos is created in 2014 to these elections in 2019. We're seeing all across Europe, all across the world, the absolute damage that information disorders are doing to democracy, the way that the extreme right has very effectively and strategically weaponized information disorders. So that's having effects on progressive candidates and progressive parties all over the place. But in Spain, there's two things that Podemos has had to really deal with, which no other party has had to deal with. The first is the relentless onslaught of right-wing media against the party and against the figure of Iglesias, like just constant. And they bring spurious court cases. They're just constantly throwing, doing anything. So that's one huge challenge to try to overcome in a world where media is like shaping people's opinions all the time. But the other thing is that because all the other established parties and even new parties saw Podemos as their primary threat, their whole their party programs really in these elections were reduced to one thing: not Podemos. Like they wouldn't even bother trying to present any kind of a program. It was just whatever you do, don't vote for Podemos. So in that kind of a context, it was, that I think also we have to take into consideration that is going to have an impact on your voting, on your votes. But there are also things that were happening internally that affected those votes as well. But so, by way of answering your actual question, by the time they come into the actual government, I think that both sides have learned their lesson, that they can't mess about anymore. They're terrified of what they're seeing Fox's results, and they get down to trying to actually support each other and act like a coalition government is supposed to act. Internally, there's lots of disputes, but you say de cara a la galería, like facing out to the public, even though there are spats and things that go back and forth, they also try to express unity and being a serious partner. And I think they had a really strong influence on, for example, ensuring that the response to the COVID crisis was handled completely differently than the response to the global financial crisis of 2008. So I think we can say that they really did have a significant impact on Spanish citizens' well-being. And I think they still are having that impact. And certainly, even just their role in raising the minimum wage, for example, which affects millions of people's livelihoods. So I think they have, I think they've done well. Personally, I think they've done well in their government, in their government roles.
So Jorge, even as they're in this government and are providing things, they're also, just face this very tough election. I mean, what do you see as the new landscape in Podemos's, where they fit in it, based especially on that last result? I know that there's Mas Madrid, kind of a liberal party on the rise. Maybe you can talk a little bit about them, because that might be a new flavor of what's to come.
Well, it's really interesting because now I think that especially the left spectrum is in offer. So different political parties are trying to keep the attention of undecided voters. I think that is really interesting because we have two alternatives at this moment. One is Podemos, but Podemos is really complex, as we can see, especially because, as we discussed before, Yone Belarra probably would be the next leader, but the candidate probably will be Yolanda Díaz, that she is the current labor minister, and she's really popular, she's really competent, you know. Even I think that in the current government, it's a government in which you don't find specific, really charismatic people. And I think that Yolanda Díaz is the most charismatic member of the current cabinet of the current government, you know. So I think that she's really interesting politician, and let's see what happened with her, because she's not member of Podemos, she's member of the Communist Party. So it's really interesting what is happening in this kind of relationship between Díaz and Yone Belarra, Podemos, the bureaucracy of the political party, and Yolanda Díaz and her charismatic character. So this is one. And the other alternative is Más Madrid. In the last elections in Madrid, Más Madrid, that is, its leader is Íñigo Errejón, former member of Podemos, and he was a really close friend of Pablo Iglesias, but they split up, and now it's a kind of revenge. Errejón has created this political party that is, as you said, more liberal, more centrist. I think that is a more comfortable ally for PSOE, because it's closer in ideological terms. I think that Más Madrid is looking for the green discourse in the Spanish politics. It's true that in the last decades in Spain, there has been different attempts to create a green party, but it didn't work. But now we have a new contest with Greta Thunberg, maybe the Greens in Germany win the elections, people are more sensible about environment, you know. So I think that Errejón is creating a really clever strategy, because he's mixing this discourse with some progressive items, and he is creating a communication strategy for young people, with Twitch, with memes, with, you know, different and funny language. And I think that this is an interesting competition, because I think that Yolanda Díaz will be more leftist, but Errejón will be more catch-all party. And I think that is interesting, because in general, when you are a catch-all party and the society doesn't have a really ideological preference, maybe you win. But let's see what happens. Let's see how will be the pandemic consequences in a couple of years, when the elections, in theory, elections will take place, in theory, because you never know in politics. Maybe the next month, and as Paolo said before, we have had a lot of elections in the last 7 years. We love elections, so let's see.
Yeah, no, like Texas. I mean, I often say in America, we're really good at suppressing the vote, and one of the most effective ways is to keep having elections, not to not have them. It's just you keep having them relentlessly. I'm going to let you have the last word, Paolo, but I do want to ask, you know, what Jorge is describing is sort of the recipe for the original problem in a way, though, right? Which was that the center-left has sort of a coalition of the young and cosmopolitan elites, you know, working and is losing working class, disaffected families and traditional left voters. If Mas Madrid is the new model, is that opening it up for right-wing expansion or for revitalized Podemos, or you know, take out the crystal ball? Sorry to make you do that.
I think that, I mean, I sympathize a lot with Errejón's strategy and the left populist strategy, and in that sense, I was agreeing with Cristina's assertion that the biggest mistake Podemos did was align itself with Izquierda Unida. which have produced excellent political personnel. I mean, there's no denying that. People like Alberto Garzón and Yolanda Diaz are people who are really good at what they do. Technically, they have morally indisputable, they are reassuring, but they're lacking that something, I don't know, that kind of indefinite quality, which allows them to create a sentimental connection with the people. Right? They look too much like functionaries of a bygone era, right? And like it or not, these days people like to love or identify themselves with a celebrity politician, right? Like it or not, it's a bit what the game of politics is these days. And this type of political personnel doesn't really manage it. So while I kind of sympathize with the left populist strategy proposed by Arrejon, we know that Mas País in the last elections, where it surprisingly ran at the last minute, it didn't do well. It just got kind of 3%, if I remember correctly, in the vote. And the vote was very concentrated in big cities, right? In particular Madrid, maybe Barcelona. And so the risk there is that it's more of a kind of middle class, urban middle class party with interesting platforms, but not able to do what is decisive now to defeat the right. That is, recuperate working class votes, recuperate manual workers' votes, right? Which is what Podemos managed to do a little bit at the beginning, because it had, on the one hand, a kind of young middle class vote, on the other hand, a kind of precarious working class vote, and it ended up losing that. And the PSOE still has some union votes, but the PSOE has become itself a middle class party, in the sense that it is like the all working class that has gotten a bit better, now has homes, and because it has a little home, sometimes thinks it is the middle class. You could see that on the controversy on the rent controls, which was signed by PSOE and Podemos when they were negotiating government, and ultimately PSOE backtracked from that, which is a perfect reflection of the fact that the PSOE now represents also many voters who just want to defend their property, right? I mean, whatever that is, for how small the property may be, right? This is a general tendency in European societies, right? Especially older voters with property start thinking like the right does, right? So that is really a tough situation. I mean, how you construct a project, and also a green project that actually speaks to workers. Because also environmental discourse needs to change. I mean, environmental discourse needs to be framed in terms of jobs. Well-paid manual jobs in regionally depressed regions, right? Because that's really the winning card of the Green New Deal. The winning card of the Green New Deal is not only that it's going to do things about climate change, but is that it is going to offer jobs that by their nature
development.
Are very dispersed and are well paid. So I think that one would need to have that as an ingredient for a winning proposal after all that has happened.
I would agree. I think we probably all would agree. You know, everybody sort of, especially in the pandemic, which we touched on, you know, sort of briefly, I always say there's no libertarians in a pandemic, the way that there's no atheists in a foxhole. Everything's kind of gotten whacked over that direction. It's just nobody trusts anybody to deliver social democracy. And I think this is sort of a communications and policy failure of the center-left globally. And that's why we have shows like this to talk about it. But thank you so much for coming on, Cristina, Jorge, Paolo. And hopefully you can come on back soon. And as we get closer to the elections, we can see what's shaking out.
For sure.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation.